Hello, everybody. I can tell from the church bells going off next door that it is 6 o'clock. So we are here for another session of our Pena in Action Coalition book discussion sessions, our penultimate session. We are finishing up our discussion of The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantu today and on Friday. And today's session, I gather, is going to cover content. I should say the theme is such that either the epilogue and or the author's note could both be covered in people's thoughts and comments. We finished up part 3 on Monday. So today and Friday is all about the epilogue and author's note, which I gather are pretty brief, but thick with meaning. So today's theme, constructed by our Pena in Action Coalition compatriot Claudia, is all about current policies. Claudia writes, oh, hey, Scarlett. Claudia writes, José claims that the individuals with the best family values will continue to cross again and again to be with their families, building up a record of deportations in the process. In this way, he says, the U.S. is making criminals out of those who could become its very best citizens. It's page 237. Do you agree with José? Why or why not? As well, do you believe that our national policies have contributed to the events unfolding at the border? Are our current policies helping or alleviating the situation at the border? Are our current policies achieving their desired intent? What is that intent? What are your comments and thoughts? So obviously, current policy, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is hot button. This is the stuff that Sunday morning cable news pundit shout fests are made of. Obviously, a lot of people have a lot of different thoughts and opinions about this topic. And everyone who has participated in the discussion thus far has been respectful and completely, in keeping with the deliberative and respectful nature of the events that we were hoping to have with this. So I have no reason to believe that it will be any different today, even as we get into topics that get the blood pumping. But this is important, the rest of the book has been concerned so much with what is absolutely important in terms of the personal impact of the reality at the border on the lives of the immigrants crossing it, as well as on the officials enforcing that border. And that's incredibly important. And as we've talked about before, the fact that this is written in a memoir mode just shows the power of art to move us to better understanding, and hopefully through better understanding to some kind of action. And here, when we get into current policies, though, is where that action can actually potentially come into play, because it's the policies that govern all of this. It's, what the law states and what the executive branch enforces or does not enforce that creates the situations that lead to all the stories and anecdotes that we've been talking about all this time. So again, Claudia asks, do you believe that our national policies have contributed to the events unfolding at the border? Are our current policies helping or alleviating the situation at the border? Are our current policies achieving their desired intent? What is that intent? And so our PYAC contributors have tackled those questions from a variety of directions. And I'll start, as I have usually done, with Cindy, who at the end of her comments that I hardly mentioned immigration policy. If that is to be the focus today, feel free to barely mention anything that I wrote. But as always with Cindy, her thoughts are so insightful and humane that I would not dream of not sharing some of her thoughts. Because it's not always about just the questions being asked. We have every right to share the other thoughts and opinions and impressions that come to us, and you are always so good at doing that, Cindy. So she writes, as I begin to reread the epilogue, and she helps us with our understanding of what an epilogue is by saying a comment or a conclusion on the work that precedes it, I am struck with how brief it is. The line becomes a river is packed with so much on which to chew, and now this brief comment or conclusion. Interesting. She continues, as I read the first paragraph, excuse me, Francisco greets a horseman, and she wonders, isn't there a lot in literature about horsemen and their significance? There sure is, and if anybody wants to comment on other literary horsemen or cultural horsemen, please do. So Francisco greets a horseman. On page 245, Francisco greets him. He's unnamed, this horseman. Is this another way of dealing with the questions of identity? Cindy's listening and Scarlett says, good. Glad that you guys could work that out so you could both participate. So is the fact that he's unnamed another deal with identity? Francisco greets him in Spanish, buenos tardes, good afternoon. She says she thinks, I'll Google later. That matches my very limited knowledge of Spanish. I think she was right there. The horseman queries, La migra, ranger? No, I assured him, just a tourist. Francisco had been La migra. His mother had been a ranger. Now he says he is, quote, just a tourist. First of all, Cindy says, I rarely use the word just in its meaning of only. To me, it minimizes whatever follows the word, and I do not want to minimize anything. If Francisco is minimizing what a tourist is he really then maximizing all that he has seen, experienced, struggled with in the writing of this memoir? And I think that is an awesome interpretation. Awesome, in fact, especially in bringing your own experience and your own thoughts of the word just and what that means to the text. On paragraph 2, the unnamed Mexican identifies with his village, beaming with pride. Again, identity. Lo and behold, he says, we make money from tourists, connecting back to Francisco's statement of being just a tourist. So much for minimizing the word just, Cindy says. Cindy continues, I had a vivid connection when I read this paragraph. Her husband, Jim, and I, she says, Jim and I took a trip to the Escalante, the grand staircase in the Canyonlands. A native woman with her young child had her jewelry set out at one of the rest stops. We make our money from tourists, the book said. I remember that I always think that I should buy something when I look at the array of items. I wonder if Francisco bought anything. On to paragraph 3, page 245. Cindy continues, the Mexican, or we think he is Mexican. It does not state that he is or is not. When Francisco asked if many Americans crossed over to visit, the horseman perhaps knew what Francisco was really asking was, is it safe to come here? Almost offhandedly, the horseman said, sure, and goes on to say that the narcos, rangers, and La Migra leave us alone. Their connection has words left unsaid. They are reading each other. I'll come for you in the morning, the Mexican or the horseman says, to take Francisco to a, quote, nice restaurant without Francisco asking. As I think about this beginning to the epilogue, Cindy says, I think this sounds like it could be another dream of Francisco's, this time a good dream. Dreams play an important part in this memoir. Certainly they have come up time and time again, haven't they? Could the way that this epilogue is written as a story be the comment that there is no conclusion, that conclusion is yet to be? It is evolving. It is up to us to write the conclusion. as we bring awareness to these issues and encourage immigration policies. There, see, Cindy, you brought up immigration policy after all. Near the end of page 245, Francisco references, quote, "The rugged Sierra del Carmen, formed by the shifting of ancient seas and the endless faulting of the earth's crust, smoldered pink with the last light of the day." Throughout the book, he writes vivid descriptions of the landscape. Is this a statement that nature is all around us, for us to see with clear eyes, something good and beautiful? In the last paragraph on page 245, Francisco refers to this man as, quote, "my guide," and we certainly all need guidance through the issue of immigration. Francisco says, quote, "my safekeeping depended upon this stranger, leading me into the silent and unfamiliar streets of his village," end quote. Is that similar to what immigrants do when their safekeeping depended upon coyotes, who led them into the silent and unfamiliar desert? And on page 247, as Francisco was swimming in the Rio Grande, the waters of the river flowed pale and brown, liquid earth washing over me like so many human hands, like a skin unending. The line which is the border that becomes a river, liquid earth like so many hands, like so many migrants. I wonder how Francisco titled his book. She wonders. She's always got excellent insights. I always really enjoy what Cindy brings in her thoughts on these. I'll leave those to the rest of you to soak in for a moment. But it's always sorry, my boyfriend is opening an envelope right by my speaker. It's always good to, when you get to the end of a book, to reflect on the title and what the title, in the fullness of the piece of literature, what the title means now at the end as compared to what it might have seemed to mean at the beginning. And it's, I don't often do this, but it is interesting to think about why and how an author chose their title and not just what the title means. All right. So we have some comments from Scarlett also. Scarlett writes, I have already commented in the previous session on some of Claudia's questions for this session, specifically the remarks of José about the US making criminals out of those who could become its best citizens. And yes, Scarlett says, I agree with him. Doing so is one result of not taking the time to learn who José and others like him are, an example of loss of identity, of knowing only the numbers and not the human beings. Absolutely. Identity keeps coming up, and I think this is not even the second time that someone has remarked upon the José's notion that the United States is punishing some of those who would be the finest kind of citizens that we could want, the people who are focused on family matters. We've got a comment from Claudia, I think, coming back to that last bit of Cindy's statements. Claudia writes, I wonder if Cantu is just absorbing himself in nature. The border seems unnatural. I thought it was interesting to see that as an American, he can freely move back and forth over the border. It seems to be a privilege for Americans, doesn't it? And Scarlett says, check out the interview on C-SPAN in which Cantu addresses that. I believe that's one of the links that we have on our further reading list. If that's correct, you all can check that out easily by visiting the further reading list attached to our Facebook page. Alrighty, so the title, that is, yes. Okay, so back to Scarlett. As for Claudia's other questions, I do believe that our national policies, previous and current, have and are contributing to the current situation at the border. Are those policies achieving their desired intent, i.e. the intent of those making the policies? Absolutely. Cantu makes it clear, as do other authors, that moving the crossing points out of the populated areas into the desert was intended to discourage persons crossing. However, the policymakers did not understand the desperation to flee the dangerous conditions that enveloped those wanting and needing to get away. The most awful part of the results, the death of so many trying to cross, is that the policymakers have not seemed to care. It seems that these desperate people don't matter. How can we live with that? I thought that I was affected the first time I read the book. This time I seem to be haunted. And Scarlett also adds, I agree with Cindy's comment that perhaps the point of the brief epilogue is that the conclusion is yet to be, and it is up to those of us who have read and digested the book to work at writing it. Absolutely. And yeah, I think your comments about the lack of evident compassion on the parts of policymakers, I think that really speaks for itself. And in the interest of a brand of fairness that I don't often indulge in, I will state that I, for one, am fully aware that these policies have been put in place under administrations of both parties, that members of both parties have voted for these policies in Congress. So it's not exclusively a right versus left, conservative versus liberal thing, although I think there are major differences between the approaches that the parties take. All right. Thank you, Scarlett. Got some comments too from Mickey. And so Mickey, I know, is referencing a couple of different things. Number one, again, she's referencing something that can be found on our further reading list. She's going to reference a book that she is going through that is on that list. And she also references another document, another experience that the group was able to have, which was getting some questions that we had answered by a Marine who was stationed for a time at the border. So not a border agent, but a Marine who was stationed at the border. And we'd put out this list of questions, hoping we could get someone with some experience of working at the border to provide their perspective on certain things. And we had this one person respond anonymously, which was really amazing. And so a little while before we started this evening, I posted a link to that question and answer page on our Facebook timeline as well. So while you're going to look for the further reading list, which is a pinned post, so it should be the first thing you see at the top of our Facebook page, the next post you should see somewhere in there. I don't know how Facebook arranges it, but you should see the link to the questions answered by a Marine who worked on the border. And the reason I bring it up is because Mickey's comments reference that at some point. We've got some references to horses. I think I don't always see all of the comments that come in, because I think you're referencing a comment that I can't see. Sometimes when I'm done with the live broadcast, I go back and I look at the broadcast page and I see there's comments that I have not seen that are sitting there. So I think sounds like maybe Ed has provided some references for literary horses that you can all enjoy. All right, so Mickey's comments. So she says, I am right now reading from our list a book called This Land is Our Land by Suketu Mehta. This book does not focus on just U.S. migration, but the worldwide issues around movement, wars, food, climate, etc., but focuses on the conflict, oppression, and or colonization of third world spaces and countries by wealthy countries. The title is referring to the fact that the land belongs to the people or tribe who have lived on the land for years versus, for example, the United Kingdom owning India during its reign over it. but also the companies who have taken control and treasure of the land from the indigenous people, whether it's oil, diamonds, or coffee. The people produce it, often in back-breaking labor for pennies, and yet the bounty of either goods or money goes to the company or the country or the ruling class. We are using too small a lens if we, in this country, think that if we quote unquote fix the border to our south, that all will be well. The whole world is affected by these same kinds of issues, and we'd best begin to both get our house in order, but also work hard to solve worldwide problems because they affect us whether we like it or not. And we're seeing a lot of reaction in the age of the coronavirus. People saying that a certain stated closed off international policy seems to be, vindicated in some way by if only we'd listened to certain politicians, we wouldn't be suffering this. And I think that ignores the incredible, complicated interconnectedness of this planet that is not going to be obviated by taking a snip, snip, snip one day and suddenly we're on our own and everything will be better. And, that wouldn't be good for us. It wouldn't be good for the countries that we're currently supporting. It might eventually be kind of good for the countries we're currently exploiting, but probably not in the near term. It's a complex issue, and simply shutting everything down, closing our borders of all types, is not the answer that I think, the people observing the coronavirus think it is. And Mickey's comments just make me think of that, because she's pointing out that interconnectedness of everyone, and that's largely due to developed nations' hubris in putting our fingers into all of these places and deciding that we know best and that what we say goes. And this hasn't always proven to be the most effective way of running a world, has it? But the idea that we could have avoided the coronavirus or something, that's pure wishful thinking on the part of people who are probably increasingly desperate to believe something. And Mickey goes on to say, yes, we need to fix immigration issues for our borders, but really work hard to be sure the whole world is safe. It's the only one we have, and it's getting smaller. This virus is a symptom and a lesson. What might happen if the virus explodes in a Syrian refugee camp? Absolutely. That's just absolutely the reality of the situation. We are all one world, and borders are an imaginary construct that aren't going to protect us from the boogeyman. I see Claudia has added something here about the passage of Americans back and forth. Claudia says, for decades, many Americans and Mexicans in border towns traveled freely back and forth over the border to shop, visit, and celebrate with families. Why has that changed? Is it to ensure a pool of cheap labor, a workforce that is forced into the shadows and must accept whatever working conditions and wages the employers dictate? Would our energies and monies be better utilized by targeting drug cartels and not people coming here to work? Especially as Mickey pointed out, our policies have driven many small businesses and farms out of work in our neighboring countries. Yeah, it always seems like on a national level, we're just not quite focused where we could do the most good. And it's always about punishing those who least deserve and can least sustain punishment, but they're the easiest for us to punish. And so there it goes. Back to Mickey's answers here. She switches gears. When I recently reread the answers from the Marine who served on the border and was kind enough to discuss this topic, I was struck by how he synthesized the issues of borders around the world. And Mickey quotes from that Marine's answers. At the end of the day, poor people are suffering the consequences, trying to escape extreme poverty and dying along the way, trying to reach it or paying to get across, creating a business of its own. The cycle just keeps repeating itself at the southern border, just like it is all over the world, wherever we are involved. You can repeat the same question process on every continent we touch and question the money, lives, and resources spent and wasted at every border, US and abroad. That's a United States Marine who served at the border, speaking freely and anonymously about how he or she sees the situation at the border, and it pretty much mirrors what us us bleeding hearts have to say about it. So that's interesting. Had some notes also from Ed. He refers first to a passage on pages 234 and 235. Jose talks about how an educated people and educated leaders won't allow a country to become overrun by criminals, and he indicates that the education is suppressed by the criminal element in Mexico. I find it interesting that that is the assessment coming from a Mexican person, and I also have to wonder what implications that has in store for our country, where there's an argument to be made that the overrunning by criminals is underway, and also there have been decades of criticism, some right and some not so right, of the education system and how well it's preparing our youth to become adults and be well informed and educated members of society. So it's an interesting observation for sure. Ed continues about something he read on page 237. Jose says that immigrants with a strong family love and concern that are deported over and over again by our government when they attempt to recross the border will keep trying because of their love of family, regardless of mountains, desert, rivers, guns, etc. And these are exactly the type of people which we should have in the US. So there's that observation again. I think that struck a lot of us. And that's come up a few times as a result. And it just, again, it's just wild who we choose to punish and who does not face punishment. And Ed finishes by talking of the author's note. In the author's note, Cantu discusses our compassion and empathy for immigrants, but that we need more than that. We must hold accountable ourselves, the non-human members of our society, and others, even if this means not being loyal to political parties and religious and educational institutions. We must find ways to push against these non-human policies and institutions. And that's an excellent call to action, which I think we are all looking for, and we're all wondering what is next? What can we do? I wrote another little thing that I was thinking about sharing. I don't know. It's a little bit more of Alex's soapbox, which I wrote because a couple of folks had referenced to the reading list, and I'm still sort of thinking about on the day of our first in-person session way back at the beginning of March, we had a question about our reading list and the perception that the reading list that we put together had a liberal bias or leaned in that direction. I don't know. Should I share my thoughts with the caveat that this would be an Alex original and reflecting only my own opinions? I'll go ahead. So I was taken aback by that at the time, and everything was in such flux, and we're trying to find enough seats for all the people who were showing up that I didn't have a ready answer to it. But I did have one answer came to mind in the course of that evening that I did not get a chance to share with the group or the person who brought up their concern, and that is that this group, while certainly remaining open to all and promoting conversations between people with differing viewpoints, is itself allowed to have a viewpoint, and is under no obligation to present a perfectly neutral, both sides perspective of the issues that we're digging into. We are nonpartisan in our activities. And individually, we all have different positions. You know, we have little varying degrees, certainly among ourselves. And the activities themselves are designed for everyone to be able to share in them, for anyone from the community to come in. And I hope there are people out there listening to this session with a broad range of opinions. But this group started in a very specific way for very specific reasons, and those reasons are broadly pro-immigrant and pro-questioning the status quo of immigration policy in this country. So it's completely appropriate, to my mind, to have a reading list that leans one way and not the other. That was the answer I came up in my head that night. I think there's a larger truth beyond that, one that I will not dwell on for too long. And again, this is Alex's opinion. And if Alex was in the position to be the face of these sessions. So unfortunately, you get Alex's little soapbox sometimes. But it's my opinion, my perspective, but I feel like it's well considered. And that point is that most of the books that are telling the truth about this issue tend to get labeled as leftist or progressive or liberal. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, you have books that are maybe self-referentially right-wing or conservative, and they tend, I feel, to be less truthful. They have a perspective that doesn't include painting a complete picture. Because when you paint a complete picture, you can't help but portray the human suffering and desperation of migrants and this complicity of the American system that we've been talking about, really the whole, Western world order system that we've been talking about a lot today. And again, I will hasten to add that system has existed under both liberals and conservatives. But that doesn't fit the narrative that migrants are invaders and that there isn't enough here for us real Americans to share with them. Because when you're coming from that argument, that's an argument in bad faith and is thus less truthful automatically. And so the books that come from that perspective are largely of a lower worth for our purposes of really getting into this issue. And I think if you went and you surveyed the authors of the books that did show up on our list, I think a lot of them would probably be very surprised to be considered left-wing or liberal. I think there are people who are passionate about the issue or who learned about the issue and felt it needed to be explored. And in the course of exploring the issue, laid it out as honestly as they possibly could. So that's, I think, in my mind, why a book list that the organizers of this did not set out to find liberal books, but the books that ended up on the list could be perceived by someone as having a liberal bent. I think that's why that happened, just sort of naturally. That's my opinion. That's Alex's soapbox. We had some more comments over here. We'll get away from Alex's soapbox with a couple comments from Mickey. FYI, this president's 2019 wish list for spending was $26 billion for a wall plus $18 billion for enforcement and detention. According to Pew Hispanic Center, that is almost the combined gross domestic product of El Salvador and Honduras at $48 billion. So there's that. How horrifying. And Mickey says, would we have a better use of that money to support those economies instead? Even a small influx of that money would be such a huge influence in those places. I think that certainly speaks for itself. Let's see, Claudia. Okay, this is interesting, Claudia. Claudia says, I think I've focused so much on the migrants that I've overlooked the impact of our policies on nature. This is in response to what Cantu said about concerns for that which is not human. And Ed referenced that as well in his comments. And I was honestly not 100% sure what he meant by that. So that I'm glad for Claudia's clarification, and that makes perfect sense. Claudia continues, I've been reading about the devastation on wildlife from our policies. Migration patterns are disrupted. Some species are endangered. Flooding has been exacerbated. Tribal lands have been cut in two, etc. I think that the land and nature is important to Cantu too. Absolutely. And, you hear horror stories of, butterfly refuges being bulldozed and species that are going to possibly go extinct because their territories are being wiped out. And it's just yet another level of tragedy to this whole tragic situation. And speaking as a tree hugging pagan druid, who sees news stories about, oh, well, we couldn't we couldn't we couldn't expand that freeway because there was a church there, and the church people didn't want to give that up, and we respect that because we have freedom of religion in this country. When are the pagans going to rise up and say nature is our church and we don't want you effing with it anymore? I'll be on the front lines when somebody's willing to lead that movement, because goddamn. Okay. But yes, Claudia, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really, really important. And the whole thing makes my blood boil, which I respond to by laughing. Okay. So that's the end of our prepared comments from the group today. We've got one more session coming up on Friday, like I said earlier. I'm sad to see this coming to an end, but it'll be good to take a little break. But on that note, we are preparing a survey so that people can, even if you haven't participated in leaving comments or anything like that, if you followed us along at any point in this process, you can take that survey. I'm sure Mickey will be sending it out to our mailing list, and I can also make it available on Facebook, and maybe we can think of some other clever ways to get it out to people. But you can let us know what you thought about what we've done so far. You can let your ire at my soapboxes be known. I can take it. And then also what you want to see happen next. What should we do going forward? Should we continue? The sky's the limit. Continue with stuff, start new stuff, wait and see. So we'll get that survey put together, and sometime after our Friday session, maybe a week later, something like that, you will hopefully get a chance to fill that out and let us know what you think. Claudia has added, I read that pygmy owls and bats can't fly over the wall, and that monarch butterflies are drawn to and killed by the lights on the wall. And I'm sure that Donald Trump has just spared many a tear for that, hasn't he? No, he hasn't. He doesn't care. Sorry. It's absolutely horrifying. So very sad. The natural world, the human cost, the cost to families, all of it is just, all boundaries are convention, people. Why are we killing things over this line in the sand that we invented a couple hundred years ago? Less. That line has existed since what? The Mexican War, 1850, something like that. So something to think about, how pointless it all is. All right, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for commenting, everyone. Thank you, organizers of the Penny in Action Coalition. I will name you all by name at the end of the next session if I remember to do that. But you're all wonderful. Thank you all for listening and participating, and keep commenting even after we are done. Thank you very much. Good night.